Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Have you ever painted your face for a college football game or traded friendship bracelets with a total stranger at a Taylor Swift concert? Or maybe you've aggressively defended the original Star Wars trilogy against the prequels.
So we've all been there.
Right. Well, if you have, you might actually be participating in a religion without even realizing it. Our mission in this deep dive is to unpack this really fascinating breakdown from the channel Religion for Breakfast. It is going to completely change how you view fandoms, culture, and really the very definition of a sacred experience.
It absolutely upends the traditional boundaries between what we call the sacred and the secular.
Exactly. We're going to explore how the psychological machinery that was historically reserved for gods and theology is currently powering our modern pop culture obsessions. But before we get into the actual mechanisms of how fandoms operate as belief systems, just a quick reminder. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. So let's set the stage here. To understand how a Taylor Swift concert could possibly be compared to a religious awakening, we first have to rethink how we define the word religion itself, right?
Yeah, we have to break down the walls we usually build around the concept of belief. When we evaluate what humans are actually doing when they gather, chant, or debate rules, we start to see that the connective tissue between ancient religious practices and modern secular obsessions is, well, it's incredibly dense.
I mean, the default assumption for most people is that religion requires a god. Like it requires a deity, supernatural forces, or some concept of divine judgment.
Right, which makes sense. That's how we're taught to think about it.
Yeah, and because of that assumption, people who identify as atheists or simply live highly secular lives, they often view themselves as existing completely outside the realm of religious behavior. They look at a cathedral and think, you know, I don't operate on that software.
Right. And that default assumption comes from what scholars in religious studies call the Essentialist Definition.
The Essentialist Definition. Okay, unpack that for us.
So foundational scholars like Edward Tyler advocated for this approach. He defined religion quite literally as the belief in spiritual beings.
Keep it simple, I guess.
Exactly. And later, thinkers like Rudolf Otto expanded on this by focusing on what he called the numinous.
The numinous.
Yeah, he argued that religion is entirely based on an encounter with an overwhelming, terrifying, and awe-inspiring mystery, something that exists totally beyond human comprehension.
So it has to be this massive supernatural mystery.
Right. The essentialist view insists there is a unique inherent substance, like an essence that makes religion distinct from every other human activity. If you remove the supernatural mystery, or if you remove God, essentialists argue you are no longer looking at religion.
So it basically treats religion as a walled garden. You cross a physical or theological boundary, you engage with the supernatural, and boom, you're engaging in religion.
Exactly. That's the traditional essentialist view.
But the sources we're unpacking today advocate for a radically different framework, which is the functionalist approach. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the functionalist doesn't ask what religion inherently is in a vacuum. They ask what religion does for the human animal.
Yeah, and when you shift the lens to what a religion does, the answers become deeply practical and sociological. Historically, religious frameworks have served to ease psychological anxiety in a chaotic world.
Right.
They generate powerful, unifying emotions, they establish moral codes to regulate behavior, and they bind disparate individuals together into a cohesive community with a shared identity.
So the functionalist argument is that human beings are just hardwired with these psychological and sociological needs.
Likely. It's built into our biology.
But wait, I have to push back playfully here.
Yeah.
If we only look at what something does, you know, easing anxiety, building community, creating rules, doesn't everything become a religion?
That's the common critique. Yeah.
Like you mentioned in your notes that baseball players use incredibly strict rituals to ease anxiety, just like religious folks do. They might tap home plate 3 times, adjust their batting gloves in a specific sequence, and trace a line in the dirt before every single pitch.
Right. Sports psychologists explain this is a mechanism to assert control in a high-stress, unpredictable environment.
Exactly. It's functionally identical to someone reciting a prayer in a frightening situation.
So does that make baseball a religion? Are sociologists really arguing that the New York Yankees are a religious denomination? Well, no, and that's a vital distinction to make. The functionalist approach is not claiming that baseball is a religion in some mystical, literal sense. The core insight here is that religion isn't a magical, distinct entity falling out of the sky.
Yeah, right.
It is simply a categorical label. It's a label we have historically applied to a specific bundle of very ordinary human behaviors. Rituals, symbol making, boundary drawing, meaning making.
So these behaviors aren't inherently religious until a society agrees to apply that label to them.
Exactly. Recognizing this overlap is the key to understanding superfans. Whether someone is a devout theist or a staunch atheist, they are operating with the exact same neurological and psychological hardware.
The atheist still requires mechanisms to manage existential dread, find a transcendent sense of purpose, and bond with a tribe. They just, plug that universal hardware into a different cultural outlet.
That is the functionalist thesis in a nutshell. Humans deploy the same sociological tools, whether they are seeking meaning in a megachurch or finding solidarity in a baseball dugout.
Okay, so if we accept this functional view, let's test it by looking at one of the most universally recognized religious behaviors, which is the pilgrimage, and see if it actually maps onto fandom behavior.
It's a great test case because we have these ancient, revered traditions of believers leaving their homes to travel to sacred geographical spaces.
Right, like Muslims traveling to Mecca for the Hajj.
Yes, or Jews traveling to the Western Wall, Hindus journeying to Varanasi, and devotees navigating across Taiwan to honor the sea goddess Matsu.
Massive, life-altering journeys. But when we examine secular culture, we see people undertaking massive geographical journeys fueled by a shared passion, too. I mean, Elvis fans make the trek to Graceland.
Yeah.
Fans of the Twilight franchise travel to Forks, Washington.
Or Star Wars enthusiasts flying across the globe to the deserts of Tunisia simply to stand in the physical location where Luke Skywalker's childhood home was filmed.
Right. But to see why these pop culture journeys matter, we have to look beyond just the act of booking a flight and traveling. The sources introduce these two concepts from cultural anthropologists Victor and Edith Turner, who studied the underlying function of pilgrimages. The first concept is liminality.
Yeah, liminality is fascinating. It describes the psychological transition of entering an in-between state. When a person embarks on a pilgrimage, they must temporarily abandon their ordinary life and societal roles.
So if you're participating in the Deities pilgrimage in Taiwan, your status as a corporate manager or a retail worker back home becomes completely irrelevant.
Exactly. The everyday social hierarchy is suspended. Entering this liminal space creates a highly controlled environment where profound emotional and psychological transformation becomes possible, simply because the rigid rules of your daily life no longer apply.
And the sources connect this concept of liminality to scholar Jodi Eichler-Levine's research on Disney adults, which I found mind-blowing.
Oh, it's such a great example. These are individuals who visit Disney theme parks multiple times a year, but they aren't just going for amusement park rides.
Right. Eichler-Levine found that these fans actually go to Disney World to celebrate weddings, which makes sense, but also to mourn the dead or to mark surviving cancer.
Which sounds strange until you look at the mechanism of how an artificial theme park facilitates mourning. If you've just survived a deadly illness, your everyday world feels chaotic, fragile, and terrifying.
Yeah.
By crossing the threshold into a Disney park, you enter a liminal space. You leave the unpredictable world behind and step into an environment where the narrative is completely controlled and, crucially, guaranteed to end happily.
Wow. So it provides a psychological safe harbor to process trauma.
Precisely. And the ability to step outside of everyday reality leads directly to the Turner's second concept regarding pilgrimages, which is communitas.
Communitas, like community.
Right. This is the intense solidarity that emerges when a group of people enter a liminal space together. Because everyone has stripped away their ordinary socioeconomic identities, a radical equality takes over. You are bonded entirely by your shared devotion to the journey.
Okay, so bringing this back to fandoms, the sources point to fan conventions, like Comic-Con, as a secular manifestation of communitas. You have tens of thousands of fans gathering, many in elaborate cosplay, dressing up as characters from anime, like Sailor Moon, or fantasy characters like Voldemort.
Exactly. And in a traditional religious context, like the Hajj, pilgrims wear simple white garments. The function of those garments is to physically erase the outward markers of wealth and class, demonstrating absolute equality before the divine.
I understand the sociological overlap there, but I can anticipate listeners rolling their eyes at the comparison. Can you really compare a life-altering sacred journey to Mecca with a delivery driver and a lawyer dressing up as Sith Lords at Comic-Con?
It's a fair question. That skepticism is warranted if we try to equate their theological significance. But the framework provided by religious scholar Jonathan Z. Smith is highly useful here.
What does he say?
He described comparison as A disciplined exaggeration in the service of knowledge.
A disciplined exaggeration. I like that.
Yeah, the goal of the functionalist approach is not to claim that Comic-Con is the Hajj, or that putting on a Darth Vader helmet is spiritually equivalent to centuries of Islamic tradition. Smith's point is that by placing them side by side, we illuminate a shared human mechanism that we might otherwise ignore.
So in both spaces, whether it's the sacred city or the convention center, ordinary hierarchies fade away, and a shared collective identity takes over. The dentist and the mechanic are experiencing a secular, functional variation of communitas.
Exactly. It highlights a shared human need to belong to something bigger than ourselves.
But the thing about that intense equality of communitas is that it's temporary, right? The convention ends, the pilgrimage finishes, and people go back to their daily lives across the globe.
Right, they can't stay in the liminal space forever.
So a community cannot survive purely on the memory of a weekend gathering. Once this intense shared community is formed, they inevitably have to figure out what their rules are and who is actually in charge, which leads us directly from spiritual pilgrimages to vicious canon wars.
Yes. The transition from a physical gathering to a sustained institution almost always involves boundary making. The community must define its orthodox beliefs, and more importantly, decide who has the power to dictate those beliefs.
And one of the most effective sociological tools for this is the creation of a canon, meaning an agreed-upon collection of texts that the group considers authoritative.
Right. The history of early Christianity provides a really clear example of this process. It wasn't an immediate consensus. By the 4th century, church leaders were actively negotiating which writings would dictate the faith.
The sources mention Athanasius of Alexandria.
Yes, in 367 CE, he circulated a letter listing the 27 books of the New Testament that are widely accepted today. But to solidify that specific canon, he had to actively reject and suppress other texts that were deeply popular among early believers, such as the Shepherd of Hermas.
So it was a conscious filtering process. And scholars examining this period, like Dr. David Brake, point out that if we view canonization through a sociological lens, these lists of books are not just neutral spiritual inventories.
Not at all. They function as social battlegrounds. Debating whether a specific text is authoritative is actually a proxy war over who gets to speak for the tradition. Establishing a canon is an act of gatekeeping to protect the community from fragmenting.
Okay, so let's map this onto modern pop culture. According to religious studies scholar Dr. Krista Dalton, we see this exact same mechanism of gatekeeping playing out in modern fandoms, specifically the Harry Potter community.
The Harry Potter fandom is a perfect example of a canon war.
Right, so in 2016, the play Harry Potter and the Cursed Child was released. And the creator, J.K. Rowling, explicitly endorsed it as official continuity. Yet, a massive portion of the fandom completely rejected it, arguing it violated the established rules of the universe.
They basically experienced a religious schism.
Exactly. And the community frequently debates whether a casual 140-character tweet from the author should be considered official wizarding canon.
Which perfectly mirrors the tension of early religious boundary making. The endorsement of a primary authority figure wasn't enough to force consensus. The fans are wrestling with who actually owns the sacred universe. Is it the original creator, or is it the community of believers who sustain it?
But again, let me play devil's advocate. A critic might argue that the stakes are just undeniably different. Early Christians were attempting to define the literal word of God and secure the salvation of their immortal souls. Harry Potter fans are arguing over fictional lore. Aren't the stakes just too different to compare?
Well, the perceived stakes are absolutely different. However, Dr. Brack and Dr. Dalton argue that the sociological stakes are functionally the exact same.
Really? How so?
Because in both scenarios, the community is fighting for its own cohesive survival. Without agreed-upon boundaries, the shared identity dissolves. Canons are never just neutral lists of texts. They are social battlegrounds over authority and belonging.
And we see how fierce this boundary-making gets in sociologist Isabel Gerard's research on the Pretty Little Liars fandom.
Yes, her research on shippers is fascinating.
She observed intense friction between older adult fans and younger teenage fans. The adult fans wanted to analyze complex plot structures, while the younger fans, the shippers, were primarily interested in romantic character pairings.
And Gerard noted that the older demographic actively demeaned the younger fans, basically labeling them as unserious.
The mechanism behind that animosity is wild. The adult fans were engaging in a piece of media that was obviously designed for teenagers, which put them in a vulnerable social position.
Right.
So by aggressively gatekeeping the proper way to consume the show and punching down at the teenagers, the adults were attempting to legitimize their own presence. They were essentially declaring themselves the orthodox scholars of the text and labeling the teenagers as heretics.
It is a textbook sociological struggle for legitimacy. They are using the rules of the fandom to establish a hierarchy, ensuring that their specific way of interacting with the material remains the dominant culture.
So we have communities that embark on physical journeys to escape their daily lives, and we have communities that fiercely debate texts to protect their boundaries. But the most undeniable parallel between traditional religion and modern secular culture happens when that community finally gathers in one room to worship.
And this brings us to one of my favorite concepts, which is collective effervescence, a term coined by the sociologist Emil Durkheim.
Collective effervescence, what exactly is that?
It refers to the overwhelming, almost electrical surge of energy and harmony that happens when a massive group of people rallies around a shared focal point.
Like a stadium acting like a giant human battery that charges everyone up.
Exactly. The mechanics of collective effervescence are deeply rooted in human biology and psychology. When you put tens of thousands of people in a stadium and they begin to move and vocalize in rhythm, the individual ego begins to shut down.
Mirror neurons fire.
Right. The psychological boundaries between self and other blur. The crowd essentially becomes a single synchronized organism. And people often interpret this powerful dissolution of the self as a divine or supernatural presence because it feels completely external to their individual mind.
They feel swept into something larger than themselves.
Exactly. Durkheim observed this in highly traditional settings. The sources reference Pentecostal worship services where the congregation might weep, sway, or speak in tongues as the emotional rhythm overtakes them.
Or in Haitian voodoo dances, where the collective drumming and dancing guide the group into a trance-like unity.
Yes. But Durkheim was very clear that this mechanism is not dependent on theology. It operates just as powerfully in purely secular environments.
Which brings us back to Taylor Swift's Eras tour. I mean, the preparation alone mimics religious devotion. Fans spend months crafting specific outfits that represent different eras of the artist's career, which functions similarly to liturgical clothing.
Absolutely.
And when they gather in the stadium, exchanging handmade items and singing complex lyrics in total unison for 3 hours, the stadium really does act as an emotional battery. The sources quote a Swiftie who is also a Presbyterian minister, which I love. Reflecting on the concert, she stated, "We did it not to outshine one another, but to join one another."
Wow.
Doesn't that perfectly describe a congregation?
That quote captures the absolute core of collective effervescence. The sacredness of the event is generated by the group's ability to transcend their individuality, and the same mechanism is at play when 100,000 college football fans paint their bodies and chant in unison.
Right.
In that specific moment, they cease to be individuals and become the living, breathing embodiment of the team's identity.
This realization leads to a brilliant thought experiment from Dr. Steve Ramey that forces us to really reevaluate our cultural baseline. We often use religion as the standard metric for devotion. People will jokingly say, college football in the South is practically a religion, or they treat that movie franchise like a cult.
Right. We operate under the assumption that the church or the temple is the default setting for human reverence.
But Dr. Ramey suggests we invert that assumption. Instead of jokingly calling Saturday Alabama football games church, what if we called Sunday worship the game day of Christianity?
It completely flips the script. By calling church the game day of a religion, you are establishing the football stadium as the baseline of standard human behavior.
Because humans are tribal primates. We possess a deep-seated evolutionary drive to gather in large groups, wear matching colors, consume food together, and chant rhythmically to solidify our alliances.
The argument is that chanting Roll Tide in a bleacher and responding to a call to prayer in a mosque are ultimately utilizing the exact same human mechanisms, the exact same neurological and sociological pathways.
The desire to dissolve the self into a larger, meaningful collective is just standard human hardware. We simply choose to label one expression secular and the other religious.
Exactly. It's all the same machinery.
So, to synthesize what we've explored today for you listening, religion isn't just a special, pristine category locked away in holy buildings. The functionalist perspective dismantles that idea. It challenges the assumption that atheists and secular individuals operate outside the realm of belief structures.
Right.
Underneath the theological debates, religion is just a label for the very ordinary human behaviors that we deploy to survive the chaos of existence. We seek out a community, We establish rules and gatekeepers to protect that tribe. We journey to physical spaces that allow us to suspend our ordinary anxieties, and we gather in massive crowds to experience the transcendent joy of collective effervescence. We deploy this ancient machinery everywhere, from multiplex cinemas to sold-out arenas. So I'll hand it over to you for a final thought on what this all means for our modern culture.
Well, I'd leave you with this question to ponder. If secular fandoms are perfectly fulfilling the exact same psychological and social functions as ancient religions, providing meaning, providing community, and transcendent experiences, what does it mean for our society when our most profound moments of collective effervescence are increasingly owned by profit-driven corporations and streaming platforms rather than spiritual or public institutions?